In this Part 3 video on the costumes of Essos, we continue to explore the region of Slaver's Bay from the HBO series Game of Thrones. Coming up. Welcome back to another episode of Costume Co. Each week, I analyze the costumes of some of your favorite shows and movies. If this is something that interests you, consider subscribing and hitting the bell notification icon so you don't miss anything. And if you're enjoying this series and want to see more Game of Thrones dedicated videos, consider supporting me through Patreon. I'll leave a link below. And I have some great episodes coming up in the new year, including the Outlander series that I'm planning with historian Brenna Barks. And I'm also doing a collaboration with YouTube creator In Deep Geek. He's super knowledgeable about themes and symbolisms of Game of Thrones, both from the show and books, so stay tuned for that. Warning, there might be spoilers for the entire 7 seasons of the HBO series Game of Thrones. In the last video, we explored the region of Slaver's Bay, specifically Astapor. So I couldn't squeeze in all of the info on that region, so in this Part 3 follow-up video, we explore the other 2 slaver cities, Yunkai and Meereen. Yunkai, the Yellow City, is one of the 3 great Ghiscari city-states of Slaver's Bay, located southwest of Meereen and north of Astapor. The Second Sons is a sellsword company operating in Essos, with members recruited from various free cities and fighting as heavy cavalry. The Second Sons consists of about 2,000 armored cavalry. Prendal Yezzan, pictured on the left, is a warrior and mercenary of Ghiscari origin. His shoulder armor is like that of Daario Naharis, seen on the far right. And one thing I noticed is that he's wearing a pentoshi belt, fabric and all, as a sash over his armor. Meero of Braavos, who's pictured in the middle, was a sellsword known as the Titan's Bastard and one of the captains of the Second Sons. His costume appears to be remnants, perhaps gifts or the spoils of his kills. The Dothraki are known to take and collect the remnants of the dead after a battle. With all of his exposed, fleshy parts, I have to say it's really a sad set of armor. Meero's belt looks like something we see on the Meereen soldiers, and we'll get to that shortly, although it is really meant as chest armor. The one odd thing is that he's wearing it very low on his torso, as though it was intended for a much shorter person. Armors with circular breastplates appeared in the Middle East in the late 15th century and were used by the Ottoman heavy cavalry throughout the 16th century. This particular Turkish cuirass dates from the late 16th to 17th century and has plates embossed in high-relief lettering with several different verses from the Quran praising God. The studded leather cloth worn over Meero's shoulder, and as you can see some of it on the skirt, pictured on the right, was probably at one time a gambeson, which is a type of protective jacket worn in the Middle Ages. It appears that Meero has rearranged it somehow. These might have been the bodice or sleeves of the original jacket, and you can see the holes from where there would have been lacing. Another little detail is this pentoshi belt, worn by Meero as a bracelet. Daario Naharis was originally a lieutenant in the Second Sons before taking over and aligning himself with Daenerys. His armadillo-style armor is similar to Prendal. While Daario is Tayoshi in origin, there is nothing to suggest that his armor is in any way influenced by it. Being sold into slavery at 12, Daario has been in the fighting pits of Talas since he was 16. British actor Ed Skrein, donning a blonde Fabio-style wig, was originally cast as Daario in Season 3. The reasons are not clear why Skrein was recast as Daario, although the actor has stated that it was political. Looking at this armor, it appears that Daario has had it for a long time, and it's not just because of the wear and tear, but what really gives it away is that the belt is far too small for him. In this picture, the buckle is on the last hole, and in the previous image that I showed you, it's barely even holding on. The detachable sleeves at one time would have been fully covered in these metal scales, but as you can see, they have been torn off, and you can actually see the burgundy lining of the sleeves. Here's an example of an Indian early 19th century scale coat from Rajasthan. This coat has been covered with the scales of the pangolin or scaly anteater. The scales have been decorated in gold, and the larger ones have been used where more protection is required. This is the only known example of this type of armor. In Season 4, Daario was recast by Dutch actor Michiel Huisman. And while the blonde wig is nowhere to be found, instead opting for Huisman's own hair, his costume actually looks identical. So in the books, Daario is said to have a blue beard and hair and golden mustache, but I assume that the design team didn't think that would translate too well onto the screen. Here's a full look at Daario's costume. On the right, he wears a center ring and sash, similar to what we see on the slavers. The tab skirt looks like it is a tab of brocade fabric with an overlay that has either been glazed or waxed. Just to give you an example of what that would look like, here's a picture of a pair of pants that have been waxed by hand. It leaves this lustrous, waterproof surface. This technique was used on all of the Iron Islands costumes. The leather shoulder pieces pictured on the left are hand-stitched with this crisscross pattern, and I think it's likely that the thread and leather were also waxed. So drawing the thread through beeswax makes the thread stronger. And on the right, you can see that a large portion of the chainmail links are missing from the front of Daario's armor. I'm not sure what this pendant is that he's wearing. I thought it might be a fishing lure or maybe an animal claw from his fighting pit days. So let me know what you think in the comments. And I'm sure there is some significance there, however. And Daario's weapons are a Dothraki arak, which is a sickle sword type weapon, and a Meerish stiletto, which is just basically a dagger with a long, slender blade. And both hilts are in the shape of a naked woman. Yezzan Qaggaz is a slave trader from Yunkai. He's a member of the House of Qaggaz and a slaver who purchases and trains pit fighters. He owns one of the lesser fighting pits. His costume is wholly unique compared to the other slavers in that it's in natural tones and not pastel shades like the rest of the slave masters that we've seen. I suspect that this shows his lower status among the slave masters. His costume is really simple. He's wearing a brown cotton tunic with 6 to 8 meters of woven fabric worn on top like a himation, which is an early version of the Roman toga. And the finished edge is of the reversible jacquard fabric is actually the selvage. And the fabric has been wrapped around the body and fastened with a penannular brooch. Although I haven't read the books, George R.R. Martin calls this garment a tokar, and based upon the description from the text, it sounds similar to a silk sari, although the name sounds like a toga. On the left is a close-up of Yezzan's brooch. It's being used in a practical way. It's actually puncturing the fabric, unlike some of Dany's brooches, which are sewn into place. And on the right, his belt is made up of a center brass ring tied with some hand-dyed silk. But this fabric isn't as fine as the other slave master's silk. Again, I think showing his lower station. Here's a reproduction of a Viking penannular brooch that I found on sale on eBay that I thought looked really similar. Razdal Mo Eras is one of Yunkai's wise masters. Razdal arrives at Dany's camp in a palanquin carried by slaves and surrounded by armed guards. I'll get to the guards' costumes in a little bit. The male slave attendants are all wearing the slave collars that we saw in Astapor, and all of the slave men wear the loose-fitting trousers and are shirtless except for the swath of cloth woven through their slave collars and that's wrapped around their backs. And as house slaves, these servants appear much better dressed. One thing I noticed is that all male slaves have very short hair and no facial hair. Razdal's costume is similar to Krasnus's, the former wise master of Astapor. The tunic is nearly identical, with the dolman sleeves and running stitch on the front of the tunic. His cape is also similar, except that it's in this soft blue, and in the close-up on the right, you can see all of the embroidery on the cape. Where his costume appears distinctive is with the wrapped fabric around the rings. Unlike the majority of the masters, the lengths of fabric are sewn rather than knotted. They are then reinforced with a series of small running stitches. He also has quite a bit more ornamentation, including these beads on the blue sections, as well as these hanging pieces here that look like oversized brooches. I also want to point out that during the second Battle of Meereen in Season 6, Razdal has a slightly modified costume that includes a different cloak and the addition of this placket. Meereen is the northernmost and greatest of the three great city-states of the Bay of Dragons, north of Yunkai and Astapor. Clapton stated, "I really enjoyed doing Meereen. It's just much more opulent and wealthy. It has a color range that's greater and brighter." The Great Masters were the ruling elite of the city of Meereen before Daenerys Targaryen and her troops took hold of the city and their fleet. The Masters wear very similar costumes to the Yunkai and Astapor slavers. Many of the male and female nobles also wear these face chain ornaments. In this Meereenese market scene, Varys and Tyrion are walking amongst the former slavers and slaves. The former slaves still wear the same heavily distressed costumes, but without the collars. And some of the women's costumes, like this one, have an almost Grecian look. In this shot, you can see how elaborate the updos of the nobles are. The styles are not too dissimilar to the hairstyle seen on the women in the court of King's Landing. And occasionally you will see the odd batik-style robe, like this one on a nobleman pictured here. Here are some crowd shots in Meereen with the slave master's household guards. They carry a long sword rather than a spear, like the Unsullied, although I did notice that some of the guards carried spears in Yunkai. Their armor consists of a breastplate made of openwork hardened leather, a round chest plate like we saw on the Turkish cuirass, pauldron shoulder armor, and wrist cuffs. Here's Michelle Clapton's original design for the costumes. It appears that production scrapped many aspects of the original costumes, including the capes and fauds, or hip protectors. And as well, it appears that she originally had wanted nose guards on the helmets, like we see also on the Unsullied. You can't see in this image, but the guards wear pants and leg wraps, very similar to the Unsullied. Their helmets greatly resemble helmets from the Roman Empire. I think their helmets look similar to this Iron Banded helmet from the 5th to 6th century AD, although without the ear flaps. Here's an example of a Roman infantry helmet with ear flaps from the 2nd century AD. This kind of helmet is the precursor of the lobster pot helmet, like we see on the Unsullied. Hizdahr Loraq was a former slave trader from the city of Meereen on the coast of Slavers Bay and a scion of the House of Loraq, an ancient and proud line of slavers. I think like Peter Baelish, who has one of the largest wardrobes of all of the men in Westeros, Hizdahr is easily the best dressed man in the Slaver Bay region. His robe here is constructed from this beautiful two-tone fabric, and his scarf looks like an African wax print fabric that's been deeply pleated and then tied onto his bronze ring. Here's an example of a similar two-tone shot silk fabric that I found from Top Fabric of Soho, which is a beautifully structured cloth. It's woven with a pale yellow Chinese yarn with a bright turquoise, so it creates this luminescent quality. Here's another tunic in a very muted color with the zigzag pattern that we see on the rings of some of the masters. This pattern is a symbol for water in Egyptian hieroglyphs. And as I mentioned before, I'm not certain that the significance of the number of rings worn by a noble, but here, Hizdahr is wearing 3 in total. You might notice that Hizdahr wears this silver ring with a blue stone. Given the color, I'm assuming that this was a gift from Dany. And when I saw his gorgeous, fully lined brocade robe, I immediately thought that it looked North African. It's not quite the same construction. This one appears to have a collar or hood, but it has the appearance of the agbada, which is a traditional dress of the Yoruba people living in southwest Nigeria. So here are 2 examples of this type of costume. On the left is a modern interpretation of the agbada by fashion designer King Hakbal. And on the right is a man dressed in a basic Yoruba traditional regalia. The Yoruba have a very wide range of materials used to make clothing, the most basic being the Eso-oki, which is a hand-loom cloth of different patterns and colors sewn into various styles. Finally, Hizdahr wears another gorgeous brocade robe, fully lined with crinkled silk. The pattern looks like a leaf motif of some sort. That does it for this episode 3 on the costumes of Essos. If you missed any of the other episodes in the Essos series, I will leave a link in the description below so that you can catch up. In the new year, I'll be bringing you an episode featuring the costumes of Qarth. That will be jam-packed with a lot of great costumes, so don't forget to subscribe by hitting the circle icon. Happy holidays, and as always, thank you so much for watching.